Hello, welcome back to part 2 of the Bob Dylan reviews. Today I'm going to be reviewing Highway 61 Revisited. The follow-up to Bringing It All Back Home came out the same year. This intro should be a little shorter because there's not really as much to talk about with this one as there is with Bringing It All Back Home, at least as far as backstory is concerned. This was recorded with a totally different band. I think a much more professional and much more competent band. Certainly a larger band. And so the band has a fuller sound than the one on Bringing It All Back Home. Whereas the rock stuff on Bringing It All Back Home has a very garage rock and simplistic feel to it. This has much more depth, and a lot of that is because you have some relatively big names on these sessions, most notably Al Kooper on piano and organ, and Mike Bloomfield, formerly of the Butterfield Blues Band, on guitar. Of the 3 albums I'm covering in this series, Highway 61 is easily the most rock. It's also the most popular. Unless I'm very much mistaken, I believe this is still the general consensus pick for Best Dylan Album. I know that some critics will go for Blonde on Blonde, but I think as far as the general public is concerned and as far as the general critical consensus is concerned, I think this is generally agreed upon as the best Bob Dylan album. A point of view that I don't necessarily share, although I think it is a very good album. The album opens up with probably the best known Bob Dylan song of all time. Certainly the one I heard first, and what can I say? Like a Rolling Stone is just transcendental. This song is amazing. It's one of the best songs ever written by anyone anywhere. One of the most venom-laden, just powerful statements ever made by anyone. And you know, nothing I can say can really add to this. You know, nothing I can say can really encapsulate how good this song is. As far as I'm concerned, this is more or less a perfect song. The only problem with it, the only real problem with it is that when you put a track this good at the beginning of your album, it tends to make everything look lesser. And that's kind of what this song does to the album for me. Whenever I put on the album, and I get finished with Like a Rolling Stone, I don't say, oh yeah, good, let's listen to Tombstone Blues now. I'm like, no, screw the rest of the album. I'm going to listen to Like a Rolling Stone again. And that happens almost every time I try to listen to this album. Tombstone Blues is definitely one of my favorites on this album. It's not necessarily the first song I'd go back to, but it's one that I like a lot. I like the lyrical turns of phrase, and even though this track is more or less basic blues, it has so much energy that I just can't help but be a fan of it. This is kind of what I was talking about with Like a Rolling Stone, because if that track didn't open up the album, a song like this would come across as a lot less underwhelming to me. I mean, as it is, with the memory of Like a Rolling Stone fresh in my mind, the entire time this song is playing, I've just got in my head, this is just a blues piece, this isn't special. Give me the special stuff. I don't want the blues pieces. Which, is not fair to the song at all, because it's a very well done blues piece. It just doesn't particularly stick out in my memory. Out of all the tracks on this album, this is probably my least favorite, primarily because it just comes across as pretty stock and there's not a huge amount that's interesting to it. It reminds me a lot of some of the less inspired material on the first side of the last album, but as a relatively brief track towards the middle of the album, it's perfectly okay. This is one of those albums where basically every song on here is famous, but this is an especially famous song. It's one where I love the instrumentation, especially those keyboards, but also the lyrics. I mean, oh my god, you thought that the lyrics to Like a Rolling Stone were venomous. You thought those lyrics were harsh and had nothing but contempt and hatred for the subject matter. Then listen to this song. As with a lot of Bob Dylan songs, there's been a lot of speculation over the years about who Mr. Jones is supposed to be. My guess is they probably represent anybody Bob didn't like at the moment. But that's probably just my pedestrian interpretation of it. Because this opens up side 2, this could almost come across as a sort of positive mirror image of Like a Rolling Stone, until you listen to the lyrics and realize that the lyrics are really, really filled with just scathing disdain and contempt for their subject, and that we're all just fooled because Bob sings it in a pleasant manner, as opposed to the more acrid style with which he sang Like a Rolling Stone. I really like the music of this track. The guitar is great, and there's some nice keyboard too. It reminds me a lot of something George Harrison might have written in the last couple of years of the Beatles. Although I am aware that any song that sounded like that would probably be George either aping Dylan or aping whatever Dylan is aping here. The verses on this song are pretty random. The only thing they really have connecting to each other is Highway 61, which I believe was the highway that connected Dylan's hometown to certain important music cities in the South. But like I said in the intro of the other video, there have been dozens of books written on these songs, so maybe don't look to me for too much background information about them. This is another one of my favorite tracks from this album. It's musically kind of a nice balladish type song, but when you actually listen to the lyrics, it gets really dark and really grim really fast. It seems to be about being drunk and hopeless down in Mexico and seeing all of the squalor and corrupt officials and just human misery before finally deciding to leave. As far as 11-minute closing tracks that never actually change at all in the course of their runtime go, Desolation Row is one of the very best. Yeah, it's kind of monotonous musically, and I would not want to listen to an instrumental mix of this by itself, but the lyrics are so good that it keeps you entertained throughout the entire length of the song. My most significant critiques of the song don't even have to do with the song itself. They have to do with the fact that Dylan would go on later to produce another 11+ minute album closer that far surpasses this one in every conceivable regard. This album is just incredible. The best stuff on here is some of the greatest music ever made by anyone, ever. Never mind just in the 60s or just in the 20th century. Some of the greatest songs ever written in the English language are on this album. And 4 or 5 of Dylan's all-time best are here as well. But the flip side to that is that the best stuff on this album is so good that it actually kind of hurts the lesser material on here. A lot of the songs on this album that I've said negative things about or that I don't enjoy as much would have been highlights on albums like Bringing It All Back Home or Another Side of Bob Dylan. It's just that on here, when you put them next to something like a Rolling Stone or Queen Jane Approximately or Ballad of a Thin Man or Desolation Row, they come up a little wanting. And that's no fault of those songs by themselves. It's just that the strongest material here overpowers the rest. You know, as I said at the beginning of the individual track reviews, Like a Rolling Stone in particular makes a lot of what comes afterwards harder to listen to.
But honestly, most of my critiques of this album are just kind of nitpicky. It's still absolutely fantastic. One of the top 10, maybe even a top 5 album of the entire 60s. Not necessarily for me, but in terms of historical importance, definitely. But honestly, my big thing here is just that I find what came afterwards immediately to be so much better that this album is almost made a little weak by comparison. I know it's a lot of people's favorite Bob Dylan album, and I totally understand why that is, but I have just always preferred what comes next. But that being said, this is still an incredible album. It's one you owe it to yourself to listen to at some point. It's one that you owe it to yourself really to own. You know, it's one of those records kind of like Kind of Blue, where you should probably be at least familiar with it, regardless of whether you like it or not. So that's been Highway 61 Revisited. Next week, we're going to be talking about the next Bob Dylan album, 1966's Blonde on Blonde.